Well, as I said, we're going to continue this morning with our theme. And our theme is human nature and the human society, the human race, and how we relate to each other. And you remember last week that I began with a question, and it was, if someone asked, what is the most important thing in the Bible? The most important thing in the Bible. That if you could take the whole Bible and put it together into one statement, what would it be? And we looked at Mark chapter 12, verses 30 and 31, which not only has the most important thing, but also the second most important thing. And Jesus said these words, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And love your neighbor. And we saw last week that the neighbor could even be an enemy, could be a Samaritan. It could be the person across the kitchen table, across the street, across the world. Let's have love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. And then Jesus said, there is no commandment greater than these. If there is no commandment greater than these, to love God and to love neighbor, and if the Christian and the church spends a lot of time and effort loving the Lord God, doing evangelism, going door to door, passing out tracts, preaching the gospel, buying radio and television time, and now internet time to bring the gospel, and yet cannot have good relationships with neighbors, we are really missing something. And I told you last week, just because we know the Bible and know the gospel and know those two commands doesn't mean that we do it. And I gave you the example of Ferdinand and Isabella in Spain, 1492. Not only did Columbus sail the ocean blue, but that king and queen kicked all the Jews out of Spain and caused starvation, discrimination, death, misery. And I've told you before, when you study the history of the church, you've got Christians killing Christians. Back in the 1500s, if you believed that people should be immersed as adults instead of sprinkled as babies, they took you out into the middle of the lake and they tied you hand and foot and threw you overboard and drowned you or burned you at the stake. And so just because people know the gospel, we saw last week, doesn't mean that they know how to handle relationships. And we therefore have to take a look at ourselves, and we have to take a look at those two commands, to love the Lord our God and to love our neighbors as ourselves. One of our new attenders sent me, I got this envelope from him, and in the envelope is a $2 bill. And I thought, what in the world? There's a $2 bill. And then it was a note. And it says, Dear Pastor Lew, thank you for your biblical teaching on a tough subject Sunday morning. You did a great job, blah, blah, blah. I carry a $2 bill in my wallet that reminds me, love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. $2 reminds me of the two great commandments. Enclosed is $2 for you as well. Your sermon was worth more than $2, but it's a good reminder. So I'm going to carry it with me. You remember it was some years ago we had Monopoly money. And we gave Monopoly money to everybody to remind them about things like giving and caring and materialism and not letting money and stuff become our God. We had a visitor that morning. It was a good friend of mine, a person of great intellectual and leadership power. And I was amazed to see him. He was sitting right about in the middle on this side. And it was a couple of years later I ran into him again. He lived in another city. And he pulled that piece of Monopoly money out of his billfold, and he said, I still carry that with me to remind me to put God first. And it was a couple of years later he committed suicide. You never know. You never know what the message, what the lifestyle, what the attitude is going to mean to other people. And so we saw last week that when it comes to America, racism, ethnicity, people that are different than I am, we better take a very good and careful look at who I am and how other people see me and how I see them. And as I said earlier, this morning what I want to do, though, is want to zero in more on the individual family, the church, the congregation, our personal relationships, like the guy in the truck this morning that I mentioned, that kind of thing. And take a look at ourselves in terms of, how do we treat the people across the kitchen table from us, the people with whom we work and worship in the neighborhood. I remember it was quite a few years ago that Hope Network decided to build a few houses in our neighborhood, about 3 or 4 houses down from us, for impaired people. And a man from the neighborhood came to see me. I was watering my grass out in the front yard, and he came to see me, and he says, "What do you think we're going to do about this?" I said, "About what?" He said, "They're going to build these houses and have those people move in." And I said, "Well, I suppose we can go and welcome them." He put his house up for sale and moved. The people came, and it was fine. It was fine. But it's interesting how people react to those who are different than they are. And not just now in America and racism, but in one's own neighborhood, one's own family, one's own kitchen table. And the Apostle Paul says some interesting things about this in the book of 2 Corinthians. Now, in 2 Corinthians, he says, it's not always easy. It's not always easy, he says. You got to realize, he says, that we have the new life within us, the light of Christ within us to shine, but we also carry with us the cross of Christ. And because we are willing to live the Christ life, it often means that we're going to have to suffer. We're going to have to do things, going to have to make efforts, we're going to have to carry on projects that might be extremely difficult for us. And so Paul talks in this passage that we're going to read in a moment about being perplexed and pressured on every side. But he says, we've got to realize that we are jars of clay. And so when we do succeed, when we do something and it works, when it works in terms of caring about people and living the Christian life, he says, we can give credit to God and not to ourselves because we are jars of clay. That is, we're easily breakable. Let's read that passage. It's 2 Corinthians chapter 4, starting at verse 6. For God who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," made his light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face of Christ. And let's hold that there for a moment. In other words, okay, first of all, he says, so my face, my life, shines with the light of Jesus. Okay? Next verse. But, he says, we have this treasure in jars of clay. We're weak, we're fragile. As we show this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. Next verse. And we are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus. So we've got the light shining, but we also have the suffering. We have the suffering. So that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. For when we are alive, we are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that his life may also be revealed in our mortal body. And I think what Paul is saying there is, when the going gets tough in terms of living the Christian life, whatever that may be, morals, temptations, but for us this morning, in terms of relationship with other people, when it gets tough, when it's really tough to be happy with that person across the kitchen table, or the aunt or the uncle, or the brother-in-law or the sister-in-law, although I have a great relationship with my brother-in-law and my sister-in-law. But when that gets tough, when that gets difficult, when the neighborhood has disturbances in it, he says, you got to remember, I shine with the light of Jesus, okay? In me see Jesus, but I also carry with me the cross. And I recognize that it is difficult. It is difficult to live the Christian life. There are struggles. There are sacrifices. It's not always easy. And so we are pressed on every side, crushed. And yet, we are not destroyed. We don't have despair. We know that God is going to win in the long run. And yet, at times, it is difficult. Now, what I want us to do is I want us to take a look for a few minutes at the word reconcile. We're going to do a little theology here. See, reconcile means to bring together. Either two entities, two individuals, two groups that were together and now are separated, or to bring together two people maybe who never knew each other before. To bring together two people or two groups that need to be together. And some of the definitions of the word reconcile, it means things like peace and harmony, to heal, to restore, to connect. And what we as Christians and Bible-believing believers need to understand about that word reconcile is that there was beautiful harmony and unity in the Garden of Eden before the fall. And when the fall took place, when Adam and Eve, as we say, ate from the tree, as the Bible says, they ate from the tree, disunity, separation began to occur. Because right after that, we have all of the sin and the problems, and then we have the flood, and then after that we have the Tower of Babel and all of the separation that took place at the Tower of Babel. So the fall began this whole problem of disunity and separation, and even hate. Remember that one passage out of Genesis that says they knew they were naked? Adam and Eve knew they were naked. Now, that doesn't mean that Adam suddenly looked over at Eve and went, oh my goodness, she doesn't have any clothes on. Or that maybe he enjoyed the fact that she didn't, or that he didn't have any clothes on. See, it's much, much deeper than that. Much deeper than that. It's the idea that they were no longer one. Remember what it says about marriage? They should be one flesh. God created Adam and Eve so that they would be one flesh. That whole thing about the rib, really the translation shouldn't be rib. That word in the Hebrew can mean the side. It means that God took out of the side of Adam that which made his partner Eve. That is, they were together. They were the same essence. It wasn't like God created the human and then also monkeys and giraffes and whales, but he created another person that was right with him, part of his essence, part of his being. And they were one flesh. And then came the fall, and they knew they were naked. Now they couldn't be totally honest with each other anymore. Now there would be hurt feelings, secrets, lying, separation. And that became embedded into the hearts of human beings. And so separation, hate, anger, disagreement, divorce, all of that, that is just part of what it is to be in a fallen world. The Apostle Paul talks about that in Romans 8. He says the world has been subjected to frustration and is longing for the day that things can come back together again. Well, what we have to recognize about that word reconciliation is that God decided that he did not want to have separation between himself and his human creation, nor did he want separation between the humans that he created. God wanted to have relationship with his people. He wanted to be reconciled. Because when the fall occurred, not only did Adam and Eve plant the seeds of separation, but there was separation between the human beings and God. Remember, they hid? God said, hey, where are you guys? He said, we're hiding. So there was separation between humans and separation between humans and God. And God said no. And he said, I want reconciliation. I want to become one again with my people, and I want them to be related with each other. But now we get into that very important theological matter of reconciliation. You see, if somebody does wrong, as Adam and Eve did, the person who has done wrong has the responsibility to make it right. If someone has done wrong, they have the responsibility to do what it takes to right the wrong and reestablish the relationship. For example, in the area of money, let's say that a 25-year-old man bought a house or bought a car, and after a while fell about 3 or 4 months behind in the payments. And they're coming after him. They're going to take the car away, take the house away. And the parents step in and they say, we will pay the indebtedness for him. And that's possible. So that the relationship between the 25-year-old man and the car company or the mortgage company will once again be established. And then hopefully he'll pay his debts after that. But when it comes to morals, someone cannot step in and do it for you. Let's say, for example, that same 25-year-old man or woman molests a child and goes to court, and they're going to send this person to prison for 10 years. Now the parents come into the courtroom and they say to the judge, send us to prison instead and let him go free. It won't work. See, when it comes to money, you can pay somebody else's debt. But when it comes to morals, you cannot pay their debt. They have to pay their own debt. Or for example, let's say that same 25-year-old man or woman is caught lying to the boss, to the employer. Just a string of lies, deception. And because of it, the business has been seriously damaged. Seriously damaged. And the boss comes to that employee and says, you're fired. I can't have you here anymore. Because of what? Because of all the lies and the deception. You have hurt us badly. And let's say that one of the other employees who really cares about that individual comes and says to the boss, hey, fire me instead and let him stay. It doesn't work. Say, no, I can't have him around anymore. So the idea is that even though when it comes to money, somebody else can pay the debt, when it comes to morals, only you can pay the debt. And sin is a moral issue. And therefore, because sin is a moral issue, I have to pay the debt in order to once again be reconciled to God. God doesn't have to pay the debt, I do. You see it? When it comes to morals, and sin is a moral issue, when it comes to morals, I have to pay the debt. If I want to be reconciled to God, I have to pay the price. But I can't. I cannot reconcile myself to God. And here's the beauty of the gospel. Here's amazing grace. God does, as God, what we are not permitted and able to do as humans. He pays the moral price. And he does it, first of all, in what is called active obedience. That is, he is perfect. He is tempted, but he resists temptation. And also what is sometimes called passive obedience. Passive coming from the word passion, that he suffered and died. So he both was obedient and perfect, and he suffered and died so that we could be reconnected again with God and have peace and harmony. And that's the gospel. That's the whole thing of reconciliation. But God did what in human relationships we are not permitted to do and we're not able to do. We're not able to right the moral wrong with God. And he came and did it for us to reconcile us with him. Now, look at what it says in Romans chapter 5. In Romans 5, verse 10, it says, for if, while we were God's enemies, okay, separated because of the fall, we were reconciled to him. How? Through the death of his Son. All right, there it is. That simple and yet profound statement. God came and did it for us. The rest of the passage takes another sermon. But that first part, while we were God's enemies, while we were separated, we were reconciled to him, by the death of his Son. All right. So reconciliation then in the Scriptures, as it is rooted in God and his grace, is that God does something amazing, amazing grace. God does something amazing and profound and which defies human behavior. We can't do it, and he does it. Everybody okay back there? Okay. God does it. God does the reconciliation, even though he doesn't have to. He is not obligated. It goes against human behavior because it's a moral issue, but he does it. And it is amazing. And then he says, the Apostle Paul, in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, we read chapter 4, but now we're going to read chapter 5. The Apostle Paul says, and now you, as believers, are called to be ministers of reconciliation. Look at what it says. 2 Corinthians chapter 5. And he died for all, that those who live, that's us, believers, Christians, who have been reconciled to God, not by what we did, but by what he did, his amazing grace, should no longer live for ourselves, but we live for him who died for his people and was raised again. So from now on, we regard no one from a worldly point of view. Look at how he shifts now from God's relationship with us and our relationship with God. He shifts, the Apostle Paul shifts to our relationship with people. He says, you don't view people the way the rest of the world says. Well, I hate them because they're green or they're pink, or I hate them because they're impaired, or I don't want them living in my neighborhood, and I hate that person, and then, No. He says, you don't view people the way the rest of the world does. You view people differently. He says, though we once regarded Christ in a worldly way, we thought he was a jerk, but no longer, but we do so no longer. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, that is, has been reconciled by the amazing grace of God, the new creation has come. The old is gone. Now, the old, in terms of God, is separated from him. We've been reconciled. The old, in terms of people, is we don't view people as the rest of the world does. The new is here. All this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. That God was reconciling the world to himself in Christ, not counting people's sins against them, and he has committed to us the ministry, the message of reconciliation. I've been reading that passage. You know what it says? It says that even though people don't deserve our attention, even though they don't deserve our love, even though they don't deserve our respect, even though they don't deserve the attempt to walk over to them to try to heal a wound, even though they don't deserve it, we do it anyway. Why? Because that's what God did with us. That's what he did with it. See, God didn't wait and say, okay, I'm going to, see, this is the whole salvation by good works thing. I'm going to wait and see once how good they are, and then I'll come and save them. He came when we were lost and did the impossible. And he says, now when you do the same. Now you do this. You are ministers. The word minister means a servant. You are a servant of reconciliation. That not only means that I remain separate from people, but it means that I take the initiative to heal the wound. Now, we got to be careful. This doesn't mean that we put ourselves in danger. Somebody's been molested or abused. They don't go back and say, well, I got to, go back to that person and get abused all over again. And it doesn't mean we got to become buddy-buddy with everybody. Reconciliation for human beings doesn't mean we have to suddenly become everybody's pal and friend. But it does mean that I look at separation, attitude, people different than I am, wounds that have happened. I look at that differently than the person of the world. I look at it as an opportunity to do something that maybe the person who doesn't have Christ wouldn't even think of doing. Like I said, I'm sitting in my car this morning. See, the rule is if you turn the sprinklers on at the rented garden plot, you have to stay there. So I'm sitting in my car, reviewing my notes, and here's this guy behind me. I don't have to go say hi to him. I have no obligation to go to say hi to him. But I kept thinking, I got to be preaching this in a few minutes. I better practice what I preach. A man was saying to me some time ago, he said, when I married my wife, her parents and relatives did not accept me. The in-laws did not accept me. And he said, lived our married life. He said, oh yeah, we would go over there, but they never really liked me. They never really accepted me. I was never really part of the family. And then her parents got old. The parents got old. And as they got older, they began to have dementia. In fact, there were times they didn't even remember who he was. And you know what he did? He began to go out of his way to take care of them, to treat them nicely, take them out for dessert, go and visit them. And they thought it was wonderful because they couldn't remember that they didn't like him. Now, he didn't have to do that. But he is a minister of reconciliation. And it was very quiet, not a lot of fanfare, not a lot of whoop-de-doo. And there doesn't have to be. I remember the old story of an artist who was painting a fresco that is painting on the wall of one of those great cathedrals in the 1300s that was being built in the Middle Ages. And he was painting this on a section that was later going to be covered up in the ongoing construction. And somebody said to him, why are you doing that? Because after a while, they're going to be continuing the wall, and what you're painting will be covered up. And nobody will know it's there, and nobody will see it. And he said, but I know it's there, and God knows it's there. And so maybe I shouldn't have told you the story this morning about the guy in the truck behind me, because maybe it's blowing my horn or something like that. But the thing is, you just do it. And even if nobody knows you do it. Now sometimes it is huge. Like when Mel Trotter stumbled into the Pacific Garden Mission in the late 1800s, drunk as a skunk, as we say, and they had to prop him up against the wall, but they treated him nicely. They gave him something to eat. They propped him up against the wall when he was drunk, and he heard the gospel and became a Christian, became a leader in the Pacific Garden Mission in Chicago, and then received an invitation to come to Grand Rapids and start a mission here. So it could be that caring about somebody who's in a miserable state could have long-lasting significance, but not necessarily. Not necessarily. Remember that old story about the guy walking on the beach? The tide had come in, a lot of little starfish had been deposited on the beach, and when the tide went out, a lot of the starfish went out. But some of them were left on the beach, and when the hot sun would come out, they would die. And so he was picking up a starfish here and a starfish there among the hundreds that were on the beach ready to die. And somebody said to him, why are you doing that? There's still hundreds there. It's not going to make any difference. And as he picked up one and threw it into the ocean, he said, but it makes a difference to that one. And so there might be tons of people in my life, And I'm going to only decide to care about this one over here in the corner, and nobody will notice it and nobody will see it, but they will see it. I talked with some of the minorities in our church, and I asked them, how do you feel in our church? Do you feel accepted? No? Hispanic, black, green, orange, pink, what? Do you feel accepted? And some of them said, yep, and some not. And I thought to myself, probably one of the simplest things we can do is to ask myself the question, how do people who are different than I am see me? And if I walk over and say hi to them, I don't have to do anything fancy, like saying, hello, are you new here? How long have you been a member? Or anything, no, just walk over to somebody who may, younger, that's different, or older, that's different, or whatever, just to walk over and say hi and smile. Sometimes, did you ever watch people in Main Street back in the day when we used to have coffee back there? Some would look so glum. But just to walk up to somebody and smile, say hi, hi. Because some of the minorities here don't necessarily feel totally comfortable. They need a smile. They need a smile. And so does perhaps that person across the kitchen table or across the street. And so when the young couple across the street, we figured she was expecting when they first showed up with a little stroller, got right over there. And what's his name? And all of that. Just little things that maybe no one sees, but we do, they do, and God does, because we have the ministry of reconciliation.